The followers of Charles Manson murdered 9 people in the summer of 1969. He was convicted of all 9 murders and was in prison from his trial until his death yesterday. Jeff Gwynne is the author of Manson, The Life and Times of Charles Manson.
Manson grew up mostly in West Virginia, in sort of a hick part of the United States. He certainly was in and out of juvenile facilities quite a bit, but he made up many stories about his background. His mother was not a teenage prostitute. She was in jail for a few years when he was 5 years old. Clearly, that's not something beneficial to any little child, but he was part of a loving family and lived with his uncle and aunt and also had a doting grandmother. Manson would like the world to believe, or I should say now using the past tense, would have liked the world to believe that he was a victim from birth. That simply isn't true. Those who knew him as a child, as a teenager, as a young man all agree he was simply a thoroughly despicable human being who always preyed on others. That never changed, and unfortunately it became, I think, exaggerated almost by those horrible murders in 1969.
How did he persuade people to carry out murders on his behalf?
You have to remember that in 1968, 1969 in America, Manson had been paroled in California and was in the San Francisco area. At this exact same time, horrible timing, hundreds of thousands of young Americans are flocking to the area virtually every day. There's Greyhound buses just unloading, hundreds of them at a time, all during the day. They go to Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco. They're looking for a guru to tell them what to do, how to live. And there many of them find Charlie Manson. Now, there's nothing original about what Manson is preaching. His philosophy is equal parts taken from the book of Revelation in the Bible, the lyrics of the Beatles, and more than any other place, How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. He wins their trust. He dopes them up with drugs. He always preys on those with the worst self-images. He convinces them that he loves them, and rather than blood relatives, they should be part of a family where everyone accepts them for who they are. After that, the next step is essentially to talk them into committing crimes on his behalf, and that turns out ultimately to be murder.
Why did you want to do your book about him? It was published fairly recently, 2013. What was your motivation?
I was 18 years old when the Tate LaBianca murders occurred, and it was a time in my life when America seemed to be coming apart, race riots, Vietnam, and now you had what supposedly were some peaceful hippies turning out to be bloodthirsty butchers. How does that all factor in? And as Manson continued, after being found guilty when his death sentence was set aside and he had a life sentence in prison instead, every few years he would do something outrageous, maybe in an interview situation, to bring himself back before the public. And certainly Vincent Bugliosi's masterful book, Helter Skelter, helped with that as well. What I wanted to know was not just what had happened with Tate LaBianca, with Helter Skelter, but how did we create such a monster to begin with, and why did he fit perfectly into those times? That's why I wanted to write the book. I wanted to learn the whys as well as the what. And it turned out, of course, that Manson is a classic demagogue, and by studying what he did and how he did it, we can learn lessons that I think are quite pertinent today.
Such as?
Demagogues do these things to attract their followers. First, they exaggerate cultural concerns. In Manson's case, he took some of the race riots in the major cities where blacks were simply destroying their own ghetto property. They weren't raging out, killing white people in nice neighborhoods. But Manson could take this violence and exaggerate it to the point where everyone he talked to would be getting the sense that any minute now a Black Panther was probably going to be killing you right after he got through raping your wife and your mother. Demagogues exaggerate social problems. That's the first thing. The second thing they do is they announce, I'm the only one that can solve this problem. That's how they get the followers. You've got to come with me. I'm the only one who can save you. Then they try to isolate their followers from hearing conflicting opinions, either by shutting out the media or, as in Manson's case, taking your followers to isolated places, ranches or Death Valley, where the only voice they can hear is your own. And finally, demagogues convince their followers this is a matter of us against them. We're the good people. Anyone who's not with us is evil and the enemy. Manson did all these things, and it's classic. If we learn that, if we think about that, maybe we can apply it to the demagogues who've come since.
What kind of contact did you have with Charles Manson?
He had lost his visitor privileges for any number of things he'd done as a prisoner. I wrote him a letter a day for several months. He finally wrote me back. We communicated through other people. He was interested in the book at first because he's always interested in money, and he sells or sold his artwork to all the different fans who wrote to him, his artwork mostly consisting of pictures of spiders, swastikas, daggers dripping blood, and the words helter-skelter, usually misspelled. And he actually gave me permission to use some of that artwork in the book as an example. He has a rather rabid following still. He has websites that his followers keep up. And when he decided he didn't like my book, he released my contact information to those followers, giving me the opportunity to be in contact with lots of interesting people over the ensuing months after publication. So he didn't like me, he didn't like the book. He cooperated somewhat in terms of what he thought it might bring to him personally.
What's it like to have Charles Manson come after you by proxy?
You know, Manson himself, if he has actual day-to-day contact with followers, can probably get them to do some pretty awful things. In this day and age, as I think you or anybody who's in the public eye know, the folks who send you the nasty, threatening emails are never the ones you have to worry about. Ultimately, I wasn't that worried, though. Of course, I could still be mistaken, but no. Once you understand Manson, that he doesn't have any grand mystical powers, that he's simply a blue-collar manipulative thug, or rather was, if you can get him in perspective, suddenly, as an individual, he's not frightening anymore. What he represents scares the hell out of me. The fact that people can be so easily manipulated.
You've struggled with the correct tense a few times in our conversation. Can you believe he's dead?
I have to tell you, I think the only way, I used to think the only way Charlie would die would be with a stake through the heart. He's had all these health scares before. He smokes like a chimney. The people who've known him since childhood can't believe that he wasn't carried away by lung cancer 30, 40 years ago. He's going to remain a cultural icon at least for another generation or so. That's because he had so many years to establish himself into our thoughts, into our culture. If he had been executed as scheduled a few years after Tate LaBianca, I think by now he would have been mostly forgotten. But instead he was able to stay, he was able to keep re-emphasizing his presence, so that's going to last a while longer.
Is he an advertisement for the death penalty, do you think?
You know, I was always against the death penalty. It was always my belief that no human being was beyond redemption, and that by killing someone we're no better than murderers ourselves. The more I looked at Charles Manson, the more I realized I'd talked to hundreds of people who'd known him throughout his life, and not one of them could offer any instance of Charlie doing something out of generosity or to benefit someone other than himself. If he'd been paroled at any given time, right up to yesterday when he died, he would have gone out, he would have recruited more gullible followers, and he would have led them to do things that were even worse than Tate LaBianca. That's who he was. and frankly, the world is a better place without him.
The followers of Charles Manson murdered 9 people in the summer of 1969. He was convicted of all 9 murders and was imprisoned from his trial until his death yesterday. Jeff Gwynne is the author of Manson, The Life and Times of Charles Manson.
Manson grew, and unfortunately it became, I think, exaggerated almost by those horrible murders in 1969.
How did he persuade people to carry out murders on his behalf?
You have to remember that he was in jail for a few years when he was 5 years old. Clearly, that's not something beneficial to any little child, but he was part of a loving family and lived with his uncle and aunt and also had a doting grandmother. Manson would like the world to believe, or I should say now using the past tense, would have liked the world to believe that he was a victim from birth. That simply isn't true. Those who knew him as a child, as a teenager, as a young man all agree he was simply a thoroughly despicable human being who always preyed on others. That never changed. He grew up mostly in West Virginia, in sort of a hick part of the United States. He certainly was in and out of juvenile facilities quite a bit, but he made up many stories about his background. His mother was not a teenage prostitute. She was